do we need to start the recording at some point? You tell me. We start everything. Okay, great. I think some people will still join us. They're walking up the hill, some of the participants. So let me actually take the program. So we are starting the penultimate session of this great conference, which is going to be on trade and sustainable development. And Bernard, Matteo, and San are going to be the speakers. If you can try to stick to 15, maximum 20 minutes, so that we have enough time for discussion. And Bernard, you have slides, yeah? Yeah. Okay, cool. I'm going to put my time watch.
Thanks. So let me find share my screen. Okay. So this paper is, I guess, on the more policy-oriented end of many of the outputs of this project, and essentially it's it's part of a couple of papers that looks at how the European Union goes about kind of assessing the potential impacts of trade agreements and how it goes about consulting with stakeholders, right? So one of the things the EU does, and I think to its credit, is to go through a process where they say, okay, let's try and figure out what the economic effects of a potential trade agreement might be, both for the European Union industries, countries, regions, it depends a bit on what the disaggregation is of interest, but also, and I think importantly, on the partner countries. And that's clearly something that matters if the partner countries are developing countries, because they might not have the capacity to do that. And this process has evolved over time quite a bit. But one of the things that we're doing in this project is to try and assess the effectiveness of linking trade to non-trade policy objectives. And part of that process then also is, kind of trying to figure out and get a bit more into the kitchen of how the Commission, how the European member states actually go about trying to identify ex ante, what are those links, which links should be prioritized, what are the likely effects of trade agreements, and so forth. So this is joint work with Hugo Rojas Ramagosa, who was at the World Trade Institute at the time, and with Joe Franco, who's also at the World Trade Institute. So there's a number of these papers as part of the project. This one kind of tries to distill and focus more on, okay, so what are some of the policy messages that come out of the analysis that has been done mostly by Hugo? So Hugo has really done a huge effort in another paper where he goes through every sustainable impact assessment that has been done. Hugo is an economist who has actually been involved in a lot of these exercises as a consultant. So he knows a lot about the kitchen. So this draws on that work, but the focus really is on, okay, so how can we think about maybe improving what the European Commission is doing? So for those of you who don't know how this works, there's two elements to the exercise. One is called the Sustainable Impact Assessment, and that's essentially a modeling exercise, right? So mostly the core of that is a CGE model, which is built for the particular trading relationship that is potentially being negotiated. And the aim is to give negotiators, parliaments, policymakers a sense of, okay, so what's the distribution of the gains and potential costs, adjustment costs associated with an agreement, so that they can then also help design potential adjustment mechanisms, transition periods, and so forth. So that's one part, which is mostly traditionally has been on the economic side. And then there's a consultation process with stakeholders, which really tries to get more at the qualitative dimensions of what people are concerned about, what the potential implications might be of an agreement. In principle, these two things should be integrated, right? So the consultation process in a way should be informing the sustainable impact assessment, the quantitative exercise, and in practice that doesn't work particularly well. So both of these elements focus both on economic effects, right? So also through the consultation process, people are asked, How is this going to affect your livelihoods? Are you worried about potential impacts? Do you see potential gains? But the consultation process is more also more focused on these non-trade policy objectives that we've been talking about in this conference, and that are the focus of respect. Now, the SIAs are supposed to be an input into negotiations, and in principle, the way it's supposed to work is these things are supposed to be done before the negotiators get going. Right? In practice, that doesn't happen. So in practice, these things tend to be in parallel. So from a kind of a usefulness perspective for the negotiators, if you were to say, okay, we're taking this seriously, the timing and the sequencing of these things are not the way they should be. At the same time, of course, doing that all ex ante is very difficult because it takes a long time. And you also don't know when negotiations are going to start or when they might end, right? So the sustainable impact assessment work for TTIP, for example, was only really fully completed after TTIP was going nowhere, right? So, I mean, in that sense, there is that lack of integration. Okay, so the thematic coverage of both the SIAs and these consultation processes have expanded over time. And they use a methodology that is defined in a handbook, which has been written by the Commission. There's two versions of this handbook, one in 2005, one in 2015. And essentially what those handbooks do is they give guidance to the consultants that are hired to actually do these assessments, especially the quantitative part of the assessments. But the consultants are also charged with doing the consultation process, right? So this is all outsourced work based on a methodology which is defined by the Commission. And of course, the Commission is very much involved in the implementation, et cetera. So most of the non-trade policy areas that we're interested in this project are addressed through kind of indirect qualitative analysis, and often is quite speculative, right, using ad hoc methods. So in the complementary paper, the more detailed paper on what is actually in these SIAs by Hugo, he concludes that only 13% of the universe of non-trade policy objectives that are kind of discussed in these agreements are actually analyzed directly. The rest is kind of more fuzzy. And as a result of that, the quantitative analysis, ex-ante analysis of trade agreements has been criticized by lots of commentators, NGOs, as being mostly a tick the box type exercise. Right, so DG Trade, and it goes back to what André was saying yesterday. So DG Trade is tasked to kind of look at the potential implications on a huge number of non-trade types of issues. So this is an effort to try and do something to get some feedback on that, but not necessarily doing it in a particularly rigorous way. So this just gives you a sense of what the coverage is in these SIAs of non-trade policy objectives in reports. And you can see that, there's quite a few, and that it's been increasing over time. So the early agreements are on the left-hand side of this scale, later agreements on the right-hand side. So there hasn't been a huge explosion, but there's an upward trend in the number of non-trade issues that are being discussed in these reports. And you can also see that there's been an increase. This is a different way of cutting up that data in terms of the categories of non-trade policy goals and objectives that are covered in these various reports. So just to give you an example, and it's not meant to be unkind necessarily, but it gives you a sense of the level of analysis that you see in these reports. So this comes out of a sustainable impact assessment on the environmental goods agreement. And there, one of the conclusions is that the environmental goods agreement is going to have a positive effect on human rights because, and there's the quote, small solar lights or renewable energy projects that bring electricity to rural areas can allow people to work later, enjoy leisure activities, and to read and write during the night, among other benefits, right? So that is the analysis. That's how this agreement is going to help improve human rights. So again, it's not meant to be unkind, but this kind of illustrates that the consultants are being asked to do things which they're really not geared up to do. So But the bottom line is it's really not giving negotiators or stakeholders a whole lot of, things to grip on in terms of informing policy debates, but also in terms of what it really should be doing is to inform the design of trade agreements, right? So what do we actually do in a trade agreement to actually help improve performance on these various indicators? So we've done a study, survey in the RESPECT project of practitioners who are working in this area. So the first survey was that we did in 2019 also asked people about this consultation process, the SIAs. And not surprisingly, I guess, you find that in particular, people who work for trade unions, NGOs who are involved in trade and development types of activities, either disagreed or strongly disagreed that the design of EU trade agreements is effectively informed by this consultation process, right? And I think given our reading of what we find in these reports, we would tend to agree with that perception. And I think one of the reasons for this weakness is that it's very difficult to make this link, and we talked about this yesterday, between trade and non-trade policy types of outcomes. So asking consultants to do that, is a hard task. So what we're arguing in the paper is that if we want to make this consultation process more useful for policy, it really needs to focus more on ensuring that there actually is engagement with a representative sample of stakeholders concerned with these different issue areas. And we also ideally should have some kind of a more transparent mechanism to weigh the views, concerns expressed by participants to identify a subset of this huge universe of non-trade policy types of issues that in principle are put on the table in these types of agreements, but also in the assessments and in the engagement with people. So just to give you a sense of what currently is being done in terms of the survey instrument that is used for these consultation processes. You probably can't read this, but essentially this is just a really small subset of the questionnaire that is used. And it's a long list of questions where people are asked, do you think the trade agreement is going to have a beneficial effect on the rights of indigenous peoples, on the right to family life, right? Strongly agree, strongly disagree, in between. But clearly, we're asking people about things where the relationship between trade and any of these outcomes is less than clear, to say the least. And, and it's also not clear that the people we're asking this of know anything, even if they, so this is where the check the box kind of conclusion comes from a lot of people who have looked at this. Okay, people were asking questions, but these questions are not at all informative about where we're going. Oops.
Sorry, can I ask a clarifying question? So
Yeah.
who sets up this survey? Italy, you say? Is the Italian government? Or
No, this is the commission.
This is the commission.
So this is what
I see Italy on the top. A question, do you think proposed in Italy? No, is likely, sorry. So this is sent to all, it's all around, is the commission sends it to whom?
No. So this is the template survey questionnaire that is used by consultants,
okay,
which is based on this handbook of the methodology about how you're supposed to do consultations.
Okay.
And, so this is just an example. Now they vary a bit depending on the agreement. It's not a cookie cutter per se, but this is the type of information that is generated. So, do you think the agreement is going to improve water quality? Yeah. Right? Okay, well. That's another thing. The sampling frame is not particularly clear. So basically people vote with their feet. They have lists of NGOs, groups, but it's not, it's certainly not a scientifically organized representative sample, which is something I think they should be doing much more to actually try and get a representative sample of people in the room. And I'll talk a little bit about how you might do that. So one of the things we argue in the paper is that given that they're already using the survey instrument, you can actually design that survey instrument to be a lot more useful to identify what actually are the priorities as perceived by the people who are interested in the agreement, who are potentially affected by the agreement, and use the survey as a way of kind of identifying what really are priorities in the partner country, in terms of where they see a clear interest and incentive to try and improve outcomes, as opposed to doing everything under the sun. So they really use this instrument to become much more focused on a smaller number of specific areas, whether it's labor standards or environment or whatever, but it should come from the partner country much more than it comes from the EU. And the EU actually doesn't take this particularly seriously because it is this waterfront kitchen sink type of an approach. So everything for the EU is as or less important than any other issue. So I think we need to turn it around, and that's what we argue in the paper, to actually use this process to identify and provide guidance to negotiators as to, okay, these are a small number of issue areas where there's a real interest to improve outcomes in partner countries, and then try and think through how do you actually go about doing that. So one way of potentially moving in that direction is to use deliberative polling types of mechanisms, where if you have the survey and the survey actually is involving a representative sample of people who are actually concerned and affected by a trade agreement, use a subsample of that group and use a deliberative polling type of mechanism to try and identify what really are the priorities for that representative group, in particular, coming from the partner country, as a way of identifying where to focus, right? So that process can also be used as a way of kind of trying to identify, and this I think is really missing in the whole consultative process. And again, it goes back to what we were talking about yesterday, because it's all about trade, the trade instrument, but obviously the people involved and who are concerned with improving a non-trade policy type of outcome, they're going to know that trade is not necessarily going to be the right instrument, right? So there's also information we need to kind of then identify what are the mechanisms and instruments that could be used and actually should be part of this trade agreement, so that we can actually have a better prospect of improving non-trade outcomes by actually using instruments that are going to be effective. And I think there's a potential here to use the process to identify a group that also downstream can actually help with implementation, right? So there's also a part of the paper that focuses on an alternative approach to this, which is to organize these consultations more around supply chains, value chains. Right, so that makes things much more concrete. People might find it much easier to kind of relate their concerns to what is happening inside a particular value chain in their community. So to bring together firms, workers, local governments, also the central government, to try and figure out, okay, given that we've identified what the priorities are for us, right? And that's the first step, to use the survey much more to identify that. How do we actually go about improving outcomes, right? So that's both in terms of ex-ante assessments as to what are the constraints, what needs to be done, but also as a way of implementation. In the process of implementation, these people, if you involve them and if you design the thing to actually last over the course of the trade agreement and the trade agreement's implementation, you can actually generate information on what needs to be done. Is it working? Is the government delivering? Is the private sector doing what they said they would do? So you make it much more of an operational exercise, which then also becomes much more credible as far as the European Union is concerned, is that we actually take the smaller set of non-trade policy objectives that we're pursuing, we're taking that seriously. And there is a link here to be made to the effort to try and improve or to impose, and we heard that in the World Trade Forum on Friday, due diligence requirements on European firms who actually engage in supply chain type production. So there again, doing that in a effective and reasonable way actually requires knowing what goes on inside these supply chains. So there again, there's an opportunity, I think, here to connect to that and to make it much more of a cooperative effort as opposed to top-down, which seems to be the case right now in terms of requirements. So I won't repeat what I just said, and let me stop there.
Thank you, Bernard. Very, very interesting. I have questions and comments, but let me not abuse my power. So let's first take comments and questions from the audience. Andre? Jacques?
I agree on the sense of what I'm working on.
Okay, so let me not disagree.
With Hugo, oh, sorry, with Hugo also from a distance. But if you agree, yeah. So I stopped.
You stop there. No, I'm not gonna, no, so I was a bit confused first by the role of these consultation, SIAs. Like, I thought if they are ex ante, how can you make, so forget 1 second the NTPOs, even if you want to say, okay, what's gonna be the effect of an agreement, ex ante, you know, it's very tricky because you don't know yet what's gonna be put in this agreement. Okay, we may know tariffs are gonna be eliminated reciprocally, but what about, you know, rules of origin, investment, IPR provisions, you know, it's very hard, again, let alone the NTPOs, you know, an agreement, it's, the effect is going to depend on the details. So how can you do it before you negotiate it? How can you say this is going to be the implications of the agreement without knowing the nitty gritty of what's going to be in it? And as you show, you know, there is this increase in the coverage of NTPOs over time, but I think in this period, agreements have become deeper and deeper with more. So I think that's my first comment. It's a bit strange. It's not clear to me what the role of this ex ante assessment is. If you don't know yet what's going to be put in it. And then something that was puzzling also to me is what you are proposing actually. So yeah, it's very annoying though. Okay, so you're saying at the moment the survey is not representative. You ask a few people in the EU, like European citizens, I guess, or NGOs, or, you know, the commission ask, and you're saying we should ask particularly in the partner countries, but it depends, you know, what is the role of this consultation? We may want, you know, the commission may want to know what the Italians, the French, you know, is the role understanding what the partner country wants, or, you know, or shouldn't part of the consultation also try to understand what European citizens, NGOs want? So you seem to be emphasizing we need to understand the partner countries' wish, but, you know, I think we also need to continue consulting the European electorate and stakeholders. So I didn't quite understand why you were emphasizing only the partner country. And finally, the last thing you said on due diligence, actually, we should discuss it more in the context of this project, because we have been talking about the limits to which, you know, trade agreements, S&D chapters or GSP can be used as a carrot and stick. But this new due diligence, the idea that the companies themselves have to respect certain, I think it's something that we talked a little bit in Brussels about it, but I don't know much, and maybe we can expand the discussion later. No, yeah, but if there are.
So Hugo is going to answer some of these questions.
Ah, Hugo is there.
Yeah.
Hugo.
But I would take.
Yeah. Hello, I don't know if you can see me.
Yes, we can. Hi, Hugo.
Hi, how are you? Yeah, but the first question regarding the, you know, the ex ante. So yeah, you're completely right that we don't know the details of what's going to be at the end of the agreement, or even, you know, if the agreement is going to be finalized. So usually you have to, and this is, you have a scoping study before by the commission, and there you have some assumptions of, you know, for example, tariffs. Usually, you know, you're going to have an elimination of tariffs, but there's always sensitive products, sensitive sectors, and you kind of know that in advance. So you know that, you know, for some sectors, you're not going to reduce tariffs completely. And then with the whole spectrum of non-trade, non-tariff measures, you also have to make some broad assumptions on, you know, how deep that agreement is going to be. So usually it's, you know, assumptions that it's going to be a shallow agreement, kind of medium, kind of deep agreement, and based on that, we use econometric, you know, gravity models to estimate changes in NTMs by sector to model that into the CG. And the same with the rules of origin and other trade topics. So it's really, I mean, yeah, you make some, you know, gross assumptions on how deep that agreement is going to be in terms of tariffs and non-tariffs, and then you get a analysis of by the sectors. So it's, I mean, that ideally you'll have that this was informed the negotiations as well, because then you have different, you know, if you have it's going to be shallow or deep, you're going to have different effects, and then you can see which sectors are going to be affected more, and etc. The labor effects, things of this type, and then this can inform the negotiators. But as Bernard says, usually this goes in parallel, and also because it's complex. Depending on the agreement, sometimes it can be very complex, so it takes time to estimate this.
Okay, thanks. That makes it clear. So you do different scenarios and the different assumption about the depth and coverage of the agreement. Thanks.
Yep.
What about the survey, Bernard? Why? Who should you ask around?
No, so what we argue in the paper is, take as given we're serious about actually trying to improve outcomes, right, on some of these things. So one thing we argue, we shouldn't be focusing on everything under the sun. You should be focusing on a smaller number of these issue areas. And ultimately, to make improvements in outcomes there, it's going to require action in the partner country, right? It's not going to require the European Union to do a lot. So I think you need to engage much more with the country involved and actually focus on what are the conditions on the ground to actually, make an improvement. So one of the things I didn't say is also in the paper, that starts with actually identifying what is the baseline, right? So where are we? Where are we starting from? And if we want to try and make an improvements, how do we actually kind of measure whether we're making progress? So I think all of these kind of more cooperative mechanisms to actually move in that direction, that's a key area of, that information is all local. So we need to involve the local community stakeholders much more in that process, and including also identifying what the relevant instruments are, which again is not something you find in trade agreements today because it's only focused on trade. So I mean, the argument, it's really about if you do this seriously, you have to engage with people in country, and I think that's the main argument I would make in the survey. Currently, the survey is very much focused on, okay, we have a whole group of NGOs in Europe and they're asked about whatever, but those questions about, is it going to improve water quality? Those are questions that go to people in the partner country, right? Because it's in their interest, but we're not really kind of making the link to trade and how is that actually going to, where is the connection at all?
Okay, so let's move on to Matteo. Matteo, you have slides or yeah, you're swapping with Bernard? Great. Thanks, Bernard. I'm gonna restart my watch. And if you can try to aim at like 15, max 20 minutes, that would be great.
So thanks a lot. It's a pleasure to be at the UI. And so today I'm going to speak, of course, in my personal capacity and not reflecting the opinions of my employer, the OECD. And I'm actually going to take this opportunity to leverage the expertise in the room to start from respect and the lessons and findings of this project to present one work that we are following in the OECD division in this particular moment that is very much in the realm of trade and sustainable development. And I think, so I'm really looking forward to hear your thoughts on what we're doing and whether you think this is an effort in the right direction given what we said these days. So this is where it all began concerning respect. It's the first big conceptual framework in an infographic that we developed with Bernard. And
You did it.
yeah, exactly. But so what you see here is this big arrow that connects EU trade and external policy with this green box at the bottom, which is in sustainable development objectives, in any case non-trade policy objectives, human development, social rights, labor standards, and environmental protection. Somehow we have something in the middle, which is trade and investment. That's the first essential intermediate step in the arrow. So trade policy has a comparative advantage, which is to facilitate, allow the movement of things, being them goods or services, in the globe. That's its purpose, and that's where it has its comparative advantage. So I think we have assessed, the Respect project has assessed the trade policy performance outside its comfort zone. So not just in its capacity to do what it's supposed to do, but to go beyond that and to achieve non-trade policy objectives. And I think this has been an important exercise. This is relevant, and it was important to do it. We provided some evidence, as discussed yesterday, that some tools which are extensively used might not work. So putting non-trade issues in trade agreements without doing an extremely serious and rigorous job on all these complementary dimensions of monitoring, enforcement, understanding what priorities are, might not deliver the expected objectives. And the other thing that we did in this project is we identified promising solutions to maximize the impact of trade policy in this more ambitious mandate that we are imposing on it. So I think, building on our findings, one idea is to go back to what is trade policy comparative advantage, and think about the link of the role of trade for sustainable development, maintaining a clear understanding that this is what trade policy is supposed to do, and it's particularly good at achieving. And one way to think about trade and sustainable development, keeping quite narrow the mandate of trade policy, is to identify those goods and services that can be moved around thanks to trade policy, those goods and services that have a potential to contribute to sustainable development objectives. And then to limit the scope of trade policy to the facilitation and of moving these objects, these things, these services, ideas around the globe. So this is where we are working at the moment. Following this spirit, we have accepted the mandate of the OECD members to extend the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index that is developed in the Trade and Services Division at the OECD to cover environmental services. And this is exactly the issue of identifying services that can contribute to one particular dimension of sustainable development, which is environmental sustainability. Now, as I briefly mentioned yesterday, I think this project has a big potential, and I would like to use this project really to follow that suggestion that is in the previous slide, to identify and recognize, acknowledge that some services are incredibly useful and necessary ingredients in the process of achieving sustainable development objectives. We were discussing yesterday the process of transforming an industry into a greener industry. So how do you do this? Mainly through services, through R&D, computer services, consulting services. And it's important to acknowledge the role of these services for the related sustainable development objective. And it's important to make sure that the barriers that are limiting access throughout the world to the best services that can get you there are identified and discussed and removed in a trade policy for. And this is exactly what trade policy is designed for. So this is a bit the big picture of the exercise that we're conducting, and this is also, let me spend a few words to connect to another part of the RESPECT research, to justify that this exercise can contribute to the debate, and it can create a public good for policymakers. So in a paper by Jim DeMello and Jean-Marc Solider that has been written for RESPECT, the two authors review the history of environmental goods agreement, of the environmental goods agreement agenda, and they argue in their conclusions that a big missing component of an ambitious agenda in this field is to extend it to services. And indeed, let me spend a few words to tell you, about our first feeling with respect to this this topic of environmental services. There is a lot of ambiguity with respect to this label. So it comes from a heading in the W120 classification of the WTO. And it includes the heading environmental services includes just a narrow subset of those services that can potentially contribute to achieving environmental sustainability. And so it's our exercise now is really to define the scope of what are services that can contribute to environmental sustainability, and then to identify the trade policy barriers which are relevant for the environmental function of these services. So it's this is a bit I think if we achieve our if we manage to do this, we are very much contributing to what Jim and Jean-Marc are suggesting as an important exercise to expand this agenda. And yeah, I think I will stop here. And again, I would very much welcome any comment and any suggestion on how to conduct this exercise, which I think is nicely consistent with the RESPECT finding and policy recommendations. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Matteo, also for finishing well on time. So we have more time for discussion and question and suggestions. Who wants to start? Radok. Yeah.
Thank you, Matteo, for a nice presentation. I was listening to it. So regarding inclusion of environmental services in this whole agenda and the work that you're planning to do. Last year, there was a submission in the WTO on exploratory market access discussion in environmental related services. And apart from environmental services, these are typically in the WTO, this MTN 120 list. They also included some other services which could be helpful in furthering the cause of environmental betterment, like some retail services. Surprisingly, computer related services were not there, though more and more automations are included in environmental services. So my suggestion may be that you can look into those associated services also that could be included within when you are talking about this green STRI, those things, because this could also help in betterment of environmental STRI. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Charles.
I actually wanted to come back to the earlier discussion, but let me ask a question about the services. This is just, it's an information question because I'm not sure I really understand where the problem is. If you want to build a pulp and paper mill, it's a big investment to almost any kind of factory. but I'll use pulp and paper as a clear example. There are 3 or 4 engineering firms in the world that can build a modern pulp and paper mill. Poveri in Finland is the leader. And everybody knows that. No, there's no, like, it's not a discussion. And if you go to Poveri, you're going to get environmental services built into the mill, because the process is chosen in virtue of its environmental sustainability. Now, of course, there are separate appliances and tons of examples of things, kind of devices that you can add on later to correct environmental problems, or pumping system. I mean, millions of things. But I'm just, for a lot of trade, the environmental sustainability is built in to the actual the act of trade, unless you don't want it, unless the trade partners decide that they don't want that kind of a pulp and paper mill. They don't care about that result. In which case, having freer access to those kinds of goods, the sustainability goods, won't help them because they've rejected them already. So could you just give some examples of where this is actually a problem?
One more from Bernard, and then you can reply to those. Yeah, and then we can have a second round of comments.
Okay, so one of the findings of the De Mello Solader paper, which sticks in my mind, is what they were doing is they were, and I guess it goes a bit also in answer to Chuck's question. They were looking at the process of these environmental goods negotiations, right? So the whole objective of that negotiation was, let's identify a set of goods which are actually going to help green the economy, and let's get rid of tariffs on them. Let's facilitate trade in those goods. And so one point Jim and Jean-Marc make, well, that's not just a tariff story. We also need to focus on the non-tariff measures that are associated with those goods. But one of the things they concluded is that negotiation failed because of the composition of the list of goods, right? They couldn't get agreement on the list. And largely that was due to, if I remember correctly, to the European Union, which would not accept a bunch of products which were important for developing countries, and they wouldn't accept that because of mercantilist reasons, right? So they wanted to protect EU industry. So there was an alternative list, which has been used in the APEC setting, which is broader, which is more balanced, and which apparently is getting a lot more traction. So I think one issue here is the political economy of this, but I think really we can't ignore it, because that's what's been constraining progress in that particular area. So I guess the point here is, you're focusing on environmental services. I think we also need to be focusing on environmental goods and the connection between the two. So a lot of this is going to have to happen through trade in goods. So yes, there'll be consultants, there'll be people who know about environmental technologies, which is in their heads, but the goods part of the story is an important part, I think, of the equation.
I was exactly going to say the same thing. And in fact, I was talking to Fabio earlier during the coffee break, and I was thinking not only manufacturing goods, but also agriculture. I mean, should the approach, I mean, you're going to be in the service division of the OECD, but we shouldn't look at these as, it's environmentally traded goods and services, goods being both manufacturing and agriculture. Everything can be done in a greener or dirtier way. And I think the approach should be broader than just services. I was a bit puzzled by this service only. I mean, unless you're saying we are going to add services to what has already been done, so to have a full approach, but it didn't seem to be what you're after. You said we are going to only look at services and environmental service, which seems to be restrictive.
Well, really, it was really very much connected to what you just said. So I was just thinking, well, I was curious to know more about how you would define the environmental sustainability. Bernard has clarified a little bit this. So this comes from the impact that the service has have on the environment. So that has been partly clarified. But yes, I was also curious on
why focus on going on services and not on many other, I mean, how we define environmental sustainability is just greenhouse gases, or is much broader than that. And many of those issues are related to the production of goods, and particular to certain sectors that are not necessarily in developed countries, so are not very related to the service sector. That's just curiosity. Why? Thank you.
Thanks, Jacques.
Yeah. In fact, I phrased it differently, but it overlaps with both Bernard and
Fabio.
Fabio. So I had first the question, the EGA is stuck, or yeah, nothing happens, right? So shouldn't we first unblock that? Because there is a strong link exactly for that reason. So if we add up, you know, a lot of research on services while the goods agreement is still completely blocked. So I think there must be something happening there. I have heard nothing for the last 5 years. Maybe that's because I'm deaf, but maybe it's not because I'm deaf. So is that being discussed in the OECD? Could the OECD not try to help to break this, yeah, log jam or whatever it is, blockage? And the second question I have is, it's a bit satirical if you want, but it's actually a specification of the first question. So the second question from Matteo is, I'm sure you can get a good answer. If a bike is an environmental good, that was one of the issues in the EGA.
Huh.
Oh, because biking is environmentally good. So if but the EU rejected it.
We're never going to let bikes in from the.
So I make it concrete, but it's, you know, and bike is a very big issue. Is then a bike repair or upgrading the distribution system of bikes also cross-border? Is that then an environmental service?
Very good. Last but not least, Charles, again. You have another, no, you kept your, okay, then Matteo, you can.
Great. Yeah. No, thanks a lot for these questions. So first of all, let me say that, yeah, what we're doing on services has to remain within the boundaries of the services sectors. This is you know, embedded in the specialized nature of the indicator that we're managing, and in this case that we're expanding. But of course the OECD is very much looking into the environmental goods issue as well, and hopefully, you know, we are coordinating our efforts, and you know, all these activities across goods, services will converge into a nice comprehensive assessment and proposal for policy action. So on Fabio's point of, you know, what are the specific environmental policy issues that we might want to address with this exercise, that's exactly what we are thinking about at the moment. So ideally, we would like to partition the environmental discourse into somehow well-defined activities, projects, objectives, protect the biodiversity or reduce pollution, and, you know, ideally map these objectives, projects, activities into specific services sectors, and somehow identify the potential contribution of services sectors to that specific objective, so that when you access our tool, you can select the specific environmental objective you're interested in, and understand what are the trade policy barriers that might limit the trade in those services that can contribute to the achievement of that objective. And we are consulting with experts to understand whether this exercise makes sense, and what would be the ideal partition of the environmental discourse, and how to build this mapping between services and environmental objectives. This brings me to Chuck. So the problem that led our division to work on this is the fact that currently environmental services are not covered in our indicator. So if you're interested in knowing what are the policy barriers which are relevant for environmental services, you don't find them in the indicator. And the member states have expressed interest in us working to identify these policies, and that's basically where we are, where how everything started. Now, I'm not sure I understood exactly your. So you're saying that if you want to correct me if I misunderstood, but you're saying that the trade in those engineering services, which are the ones needed to make a technology, to build a greener technology to produce paper, is not relevant, is already embedded in another dimension of trade, which is which is not inherently services trade. I don't know if I got it right, but if yes, I think there might be other examples where you are a manufacturing firm and you're looking for AI services tools to make your production processes more efficient, and at the same time to reduce their environmental impact. And I think there are a number of potential suppliers of these types of services, and ideally you want to have an open market so that this manufacturing company can access the highest quality services to achieve that, to achieve its goal.
But I know the time is short. Let me just try and put my point in a more pointed way. I understand that the approach you're taking makes sense from the standpoint of your responsibilities and the way people are naturally thinking about these things, which is what you just said, that there certainly are consulting firms that could provide useful services, environmental services, and they're hampered from doing that. So it would be good to have instruments that debar, debureaucratize so whatever it is that made it facilitated the trade. Okay. I think that's even though it's realistic, maybe the only way to go. It's completely wrong-headed, because in fact, as several people have said, these environmental issues are embedded. They're an ecosystem. They're part of an ecosystem. There's a broad choice of a clean or a dirty technology, and many of the different aspects of that choice are about products, and some are about services, but the services are business services related to the design of products. You can, with a lot of effort, you'll define an area called environmental services, and you'll create a bunch of special protections, exemptions from otherwise burdensome rules for that area. And the result will be that some people at the margin, some actors at the margin, will game the presentation of what they do so that they count as environmental services and are exempt from otherwise burdensome things. So you'll then have created, but on the other hand, there will be issues where, because they're not exempt, they are barred, and you'll have created one more little silo, one more little category, one more little bureaucratic operation, because there's a gap in what's currently desirable, and one way to fill it is with this very punctual action. I absolutely understand the constraints you're under, and I regret them.
Very interesting on this note. There is Andre, go one last, I would say, and then we go to Sam, and I'm sure we can continue over the coffee break. This is a very provocative and interesting point. Andre.
No, I just want to make a brief point just to support what was just said. I'm equally puzzled, I must say. I mean, I understand the good intention, but I can't see how to make this operation at all. So I'm thinking that, you know, I mean, what is the, I mean, okay, we as economists, are we environmental services? Why not? I mean, you know, where's the boundary of those things, right? A gardener can do good, can do terrible things, right? For the environment. So I don't begin to see how to make this operational. And it seemed to me that one would have to first identify what is the problem. I mean, this is a solution, but to what problem? That's what I failed to see. If I could get some idea of where are some barriers, awful barriers that are there, and that are contributing to not solving the climate issue in some manner, right? An objective that, you know, we have clearly defined, right? This is the objective, and sure, I mean, we all agree that trade can help and does help. So there's no. The question is how to make this operational without creating the kind of problems that Charles is putting forward, which I think is inevitable, absolutely inevitable. So you want to minimize, right? You want to maximize helping solving the problem and minimizing all this bureaucratic stuff that will inevitably rent seeking. I mean, all of those kind of things that will inevitably be accompanied, because how do we define exactly where is the border? You know, each of us is going to claim that part of our time or most of our time we are devoting to do stuff that is environmentally friendly. I mean, that's not very difficult to do, right? So you know, I see the problem. I don't see in what manner this is really going to contribute. That's what I would like to see. You know, identify first what are the obstacles here, and try to be narrow rather than wide, it seems to me.
So some say go broader, some say narrower. Let's continue this discussion maybe later, or one more. Matteo, yes, sorry. Maybe a couple of minutes to reply, and then we go to some.
Yeah, no, so I understand this issue. It's a very serious one. It's you know, the dual use of many of these services, which can have a potentially wonderful impact on achieving an environmental sustainability objective, and at the same time can do the exact opposite. And so I think our effort, the contribution of this effort would be in, first of all, identifying services that have this potential, trying to find a good, convincing and robust way to assess the scope of this potential across different services. So construction services will not have the same role of transport services, and the dual use issue might probably vary in intensity across different services sectors, and we can probably contribute in making this more clear and more objectively evident. And then I think the second contribution that this project might have is creating a language that is useful to allow trade policymakers to exit the ambiguity that exists within this label, environmental services. So I was not coming from an environmental background, so it struck me the level of misunderstanding that exists around this notion, And I think, having a very plain definitional exercise on this is already a little first step. And then I agree with you that we need to start from the objective. And again, the narrowest the objective, the better, because you can really make it very concrete. You can identify concrete policy measures that are an obstacle to the trade of those services that might have, at least to some extent, the potential to contribute to that objective, and just present it in a tool that can be used by policymakers. But yeah, thanks a lot for all these warnings and comments and ideas.
Okay, San, I wanted to continue, but so let's try again 15 minutes.
Yes,
if you
Paula,
can,
yes.
but I'll be lenient.
No, I'm not going to, I don't want to take too much time. Just, what I want to do is to reflect on a stream of papers that we have been doing in this project, trying to also connect the trade and development aspect, and perhaps even starting with the what is NTPOs, because in fact, if we consider, the narrow interpretation is when we focus on human rights, environmental, social, labor conditions. But when we deal with development in itself can be also the prospect of having countries developing is going beyond trade. So that's the ultimate objectives. And we're seeing the EU engaging like this with some African, Caribbean, Pacific countries, for instance, on saying the purpose is not trade per se, is not to promote trade per se, but the purpose is to have this trade agreement as a development objective and should be assessed in terms of purely the development impact. So if we think, and of course for us as trade economists, we know that trade can be very good for development. So it's in fact, it's at the frontier of what is exactly a non-trade policy objective, since trade is also in itself a direct objective for development, but it's also about how do you combine with other policies. So I'm going to try to draw on the insights of 7 different type of papers or stream of work that we've been doing, and then I will try to apply that to the GSP regulation, and all this in less than 15 minutes. So the first one, so I'll be quite general. I will not be able to go into the detail, but the first point is that, of course, we know development cooperation played a very important role, and the Aid for Trade agenda is important for this broader perspective. I mentioned in the context of some free trade agreements, development is the only objective. So the EU has been providing quite a lot of development support. And if we look also in terms of perhaps the more narrow interpretation of NTPOs, we do see that FTAs where there has been stronger environmental provisions then receive more aid-related or green-related aid to support also these kind of implementations. The same, in fact, for GSP Plus, where there has been also more targeted aid towards the sustainability dimension. So at least at the EC level, we see at the community level, we see a strong case. For member states, it's a bit more mixed. So there is some more heterogeneity of whether they support or not, but we do see this general tendency. The second question that we were wondering is whether it is helpful to make a direct link and structure commitments to the aid that is provided with the level of reforms and adjustments that a developing country will have to do in order to take advantage of these of the trade agreements. And there was a good example in West Africa. In fact, the economic partnership agreements in general was a call by the African, Caribbean, Pacific countries to say, well, if we enter into a free trade agreement, before they had just preferential access to the EU market, so they were offered to move to a free trade agreement type of approach, and they said, well, even if there are some benefits, there will be a lot of adjustment costs, so you have to support us in covering these adjustment costs, and so we have to make a direct link. So in West Africa, they really said, we want to have additional commitments from the EU really connected to our adjustment. So the Commission said, okay, well, we could perhaps consider this, but you would have to really assess what are your needs. So West Africa started with a very thorough assessment of what would be their needs, sometimes also, of course, projects that are not necessarily that couldn't find support by donors otherwise. So there was this very formal process, and in a sense, the idea was, would that help to help in the implementation of the agreements? And in fact, what we've seen is that led to a lot of political discussions, highly technical aspects, a rather rigid format where the donors and the EU was not really able anyway to provide extremely fresh new money. So a lot of packaging type of exercise. It was also a lengthy process. So by the time that they were thinking about how to disperse and support some of the countries, of course, West Africa did not also implement the free trade agreement at the whole regional level, but even in the countries that had concluded, it seemed to have a rigid structure that was, in fact, that took time to negotiate and to set in place and to try to implement afterwards, was more constrained, both for the donors and for the recipients, that a more flexible, agile strategizing of the aid that the Commission is trying to do. And so we compare the situation with Southern Africa and in particular Botswana, where then building on the development strategies of the developing countries, they could adjust over time of what they wanted to do. So the more structured approach seems to be a very good diplomatic exercise to say we respond to your needs. It helped to conclude the agreements and for the West African countries to say we managed to get the commitment of 6.5 billion from the EU, but in practice that did not lead to anything. So it was more in the process than it was otherwise. The other element is that there's a need to think beyond the direct aid for trade dimension. And in that sense, when we think about also adjustments, when we were doing some of the work, we were thinking, well, how do you support the reform of a country? In fact, a country that takes advantage of a free trade agreement, if you have a dynamic process of reforms at the country level, then they are more likely to take advantage of the free trade agreements. So we look, for instance, at the case of Mauritius, which was highly dependent on sugar and had a plan, irrespective, in fact, of what the EU would do to try to reform its own sugar industry and to try to move more into services. We were talking about services, and so I had a notion of a transformation. But how do you do that? You have many workers working in the sugar sector and so on. And then there was really a process of support by the EU that accompanied and that was building on the domestic initiatives of reforms for Mauritius. And not necessarily, especially when you talk about retraining of labor and so on, it's not necessarily directly trade related. It is broader transformational. So there is a need to think also sometimes beyond the simply trade immediate, what are the clauses in the agreements and how do we support these trade provisions, but how does that fit, how the free trade agreement fits into a domestic reform agenda, and how do you support as development cooperation this reform agenda? The other element connected also to that was we were looking and typically are the provisions in the agreement very important for instance, protection of biodiversity and forestry. So we look at what are these voluntary agreements for the protection of forestry, these FLECT regimes, and it is interesting to see that in the case, for instance, of Cameroon, then these are explicitly referred to in the agreements. And then we look at the case of Ghana, where there is no reference in the free trade agreement to this voluntary forestry type of agreement, and yet it was not at all an impediment because the purpose was exactly the same, to try to see how you can trade more but avoid illegal logging and having a deforestation practice. So it was through constructive engagement and dialogues and support that was provided by the EU that then there's this effort in trying to address the question. So while of course the free trade agreement is somewhat in the background also of the mind of the actors, and the trade between Ghana and the EU was is in the part of the approach, but you don't need to have necessarily this into the FTA agreement. So we thought that was a good example when we look at that more closely of the fact that we should not perhaps try to overburden all these FTAs with plenty of provisions. The fourth point is about the need to engage with the private sector and to think when you do so, not just in terms of development cooperation, but how do you do that with also commercial instruments. So we look at the business B2B type of mechanism that exists within the EU. In fact, we look at the Enterprise Europe network that is an instrument for the internal market to help the companies and in particular SMEs on innovation to connect together within the European market, and there's an external dimension to that. So that doesn't use at all any development cooperation type of instruments. And then we ask the question, well, but when you do that, and if you think about how developing countries want to take advantage of these free trade agreements, to have this B2B type of relationship and matchmaking with the European companies is something that is very useful. And that's more kind of public instrument to support commercial objectives, not developments. And then there's an emerging trend to try to use that also for developing countries. But then there's this question of how do you articulate this with the aid for trade? And we still saw that there's a lot of traditional development cooperation aid that goes for private sector engagement on the principle that, well, we could justify that for an African company to connect with the company in Europe, this is good for development. So you could justify to use development cooperation money. We were saying, well, you don't necessarily need, because what is the difference from that company because it's based in Lesotho compared to a company that would be based in China or the US? Perhaps that's, you don't need to have development cooperation, but what you would need is to have some support to help business associations, for instance, to create themselves, to have the network and so on and the information. So this is the kind of elements where you would need some kind of development cooperation. And the last part, the fifth point, is the question of the dialogue and consultation. Bernard already alluded to that, but in the context of free trade agreement, you have a formal domestic advisory groups where you include civil society engagements and dialogue with the partners to try to see, you know, how that can feed into the process. But in talking to a lot of the civil society actors that are engaged in these kind of dialogues, they are very frustrated because it's a bit unclear what is really the impact, what is the scope of the engagement. And so we had very concrete recommendations based on various consultations of what are the weaknesses in terms of both the objective of these dialogues, the scope, the process, and how does the results of these dialogues, how could they better input into the process? So in the last 3 minutes, I'll just say, how does that apply into the GSP? And in a sense, and there's a new proposal by the EU on GSP regulation starting from 2024. So what is quite interesting is that there is, you know, the importance of not just the regulation on GSP, but how countries will be able to take advantage of the GSP is very important. Yet the regulation does not refer at all to any kind of elements of development cooperation and so on. And we do see this element of possible development cooperations and dialogues in FTAs. So we wonder why there is not you know, more kind of explicit reference even in the language of the regulation, since we know anyway the EU is concerned about how to improve the utilization rates of the GSP, how to support the implementation of the conventions and so on. So there is a possibility to indicate that more clearly into the GSP. Think in terms of aid for trade, but think also beyond aid for trade and think about investment instruments and how you could also engage into a dialogue, including with the you know, with the private sector. How can you connect private sector from GSP beneficiary countries to take advantage of the GSP and help build their production capacity, and that will be also very important. So think also just beyond the regulation, and perhaps also engage in broader consultation mechanisms about how that could happen. There's I mentioned the domestic advisory group in the FTAs. There is no necessarily very well structured. There's a single entry point mechanism that is put in place now also in the regulation for complaints in case of non-compliance. But how do you connect that with the civil society dialogue, And do you have a regular system? And one could imagine, regular annual reviews of the system where the commission would take stock of what are the complaints and the possible problems, will engage on a regular manner with the partner countries, with the beneficiary countries of the GSP, and could have perhaps also the regulation a more explicit scorecard and so on. So what I want, I could develop further, but what I want to show that the kind of research that we have been doing in terms of these NTPOs and trade and development is very much applicable to for forthcoming elements. I now just applied it to GSP, but we could think also further in other trade elements. Thank you.
Thank you. I like your introduction also about thinking whether development itself should be a non-trade policy objective, and that's very interesting. Yeah. Maybe if I may make a comment related to your last GSP versus, so you talked a lot about trade agreements, and African countries have a lot of trade agreements with Europe, but I was looking at the list, and this, Andre, brings me to one of your questions. Actually, there are lots of GSP recipients actually still, and in African countries, both some of them in standard GSP, like Kenya, some in GSP plus, yeah, quite a few, and a lot under EBAs. So you have a lot of GSP. So I was thinking, and what is the main difference between GSP and trade agreements, and why you may need more assistance than not? Of course, a key asymmetry is that in a trade agreement, you have to also liberalize. So there's much more of a transition. All of a sudden, you're lifting your own barriers. So I think, to me, it's an interesting question for African developing countries is to say, okay, which one is the preferred relationship? On one hand, GSP, you don't have to do much. You're just receiving preferential market access. You have the usual problem of rules of origin and all the rest. But at least, you don't have to make your effort to liberalize your own economy. But it's also less certain because you may be taking it away. While in the case of a trade agreement, it's a long-term or certain relationship. So I think it's interesting to think also in these terms. And if Kenya was asked, would you rather stay under GSP or go, there would be trade-offs. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about. Okay, so yeah, we can go around. Jacques. Mini, go. You can have a mini, or we have 10 minutes before the coffee break. So
it's a very small point because he mentioned many things and it was nice to listen to. And one thing I was just because it also appears in our work on EU-China, and that's about wood, timber, particularly tropical wood, and the fleshed approaches. And you mentioned that you made a distinction between Ghana and Cameroon, yeah. And I was puzzled. But maybe it's just that it's not in the FTA, because in the flecht, the critical thing is credibility in Europe or elsewhere, because the US has also a type of flecht. And that means certification with, independent third-party verification. I mean, it's a very tough machinery just to be credible, because in the harbor, you can't distinguish the one wood from the other wood. And so this flecht mechanism is, I think it's phenomenal. As an outsider. And also China is now a big believer in this. We often look at China in a very negative way. It's not. Of course it takes time. It's not surprising. China trade under flecht without a T, is $50 billion a year. So it's not a joke. And so I wanted to understand how Ghana can do this without formalized mechanisms. Because would European or other buyers then believe it is sustainable forestry from which this wood is arriving? So I don't understand. I understand the Cameroon thing because it's the standard approach. How does this work? So it's from your big expose, it's just one small part.
An interesting, maybe we can reply to this. Can you raise, okay, Charles, do we have more? Yeah, we have 5 minutes of Charles, and then you can go back to maybe both. Yeah.
So that was a wonderful presentation, and I'm really sorry we have to discuss it in this compressed way. I mean, I really do. This is, yes, okay. So yes, we should absolutely. But one very important lesson I thought, of what you said is that the burden of achieving non-trade objectives can't be realized in the structure of the trade agreement itself. It relies on forms of continuing dialogue and exchange, which almost never or only in reduced measure can be built into the actual trade agreement. So the emphasis has to be not on substituting trade agreements for these other things, but the integration of these two. First. Second, as an illustration of that, you returned to Bernard's earlier presentation directly and obliquely several times actually, because on what seems like the narrow question of, it's not narrow, but contained question of organizing consultation in the EU and in partner countries. You might think you could do that by modifying the existing procedures, and the example of Mauritius suggests that the most promising countries have their own plans, deep plans, and you have to engage with those, and it would be folly not to. But I would just suggest that without getting carried away, there are many more countries that have elements of Mauritius than you think. If I think about mining, I think about Latin America, there are many, many capable, at least with respect to certain sectors. Finally, there are these questions, but this is finally because of the compressed time that Jacques raises. FLEGT is an enormous accomplishment, but Ghana is largely deforested, not because of FLEGT, but because of things the Ghanaians have done and which are very difficult to reverse in the short term. And it is going to take, I would think, a combination of openness to consultation before the agreements are signed and continuing accompaniment on the lines of FLEGT, but with the need for constant adjustment there too, to achieve these enlarged. And I would think that getting a grip on that set of questions is the next generation of things to be concerned with.
Thanks, Sam.
Yes, thanks. Well, not many questions. I agree with what was said. Yes, Paula, for your comments about the choice between FTAs or GSP. But this has been, at least, we worked a lot on the, as I mentioned, African countries, and that were benefiting from the Lomé convention type of preferences, and then Cotonou. This has been my work for the last 20 years. So this has been the question, and that's the reason why some countries basically quite often the question is, should they conclude an FTA? And then, for more than 20 years, we have been asked this question, what would you recommend? And I said, well, it depends what the country wants to do. And, the way you want to do reforms and whether you think that an FTA is going to support what you want to do domestically or not. And it's not just a question of perhaps, and I think the Commission has realized that, but they initially started that an FTA is good for everybody. Just open up your trade in a bilateral basis to us, and that would by definition be good. And the answer is, like, if you want to reform like Mauritius and the other countries, then do so. If you don't, and then, an FTA can help accompany the reforms. If you have no interest and you think that, opening your barriers to trade to simply the EU is going not to be positive for you, remain in a GSP. So that's why perhaps the reason why I've not elaborated, because I have written tons of papers and many has been the discussion, a debate for the last 20 years. Jacques, the FLEGT question is, what I was trying to illustrate, and I'm sorry, I was also going fast, is that Ghana is going into FLEGT and with voluntary agreements like some other countries. It's just that initially when the agreement were concluded, in the case of Cameroon, there was an explicit reference in the FTA with Europe to FLEGT and deforestation. And that reference is not in the Ghana agreement. At the time the negotiators did not need, and the outside, perhaps, the immediate reaction would have been, could have been to say, well, why is the EU is not putting that in all its FTAs, and this is really important. Now, when we look at the case of Ghana, it's really a question of engagements, consultation. It's not just a question of saying, well, you have a commitment, you have to do it, and we give you a bit of money and you implement. No, it is really a change of, it's a process that you have to engage in. And then the fact that it is yes or no into the agreements, in the case of Ghana, was a good illustration, doesn't really matter. The fact there is an FTA does influence, and there's a desire does influence the approach from Europe, but the fact there is no reference in the agreement in itself doesn't change anything. And so I don't want to generalize the argument of role to all the NTPOs and so on, but we just thought this is a good case of, you don't need to overemphasize this element in the trade agreement.
China has no FTA, and Indonesia, the big beginner, has no FTA. So they have done it without any FTA. They think it's in their interest.
Yes.
Very last comment from him.
No, it's not a comment on this. It's just before going, Mia and Joe asked us to go right after, before taking coffee, to the front to have a picture taken before Paola also goes. So I was asked to, let's not go to the coffee, but create. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you.
That works. See you later.
All right.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, all good.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hello.
Okay, everything is okay. Thank you.
Perfect. Can we just try to share the slides?
Please share the slide.
So just a minute. Let's see.
Okay, I see.
You see it in the
Yes.
full view with the full screen without the notes.
Yes, yes, everything is okay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I appreciate
Okay,
your help.
thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye. Please stop. Okay, stop share.
I thought I did. Great.
Okay.
Now it works,
you.
right? Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I have a try as well? Just to...
Yes, may I have your, okay?
Is it working?
Yes, if you make full screen.
Yeah.
May I have your cam, please?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, okay, sir. Thank you. Okay, everything is okay. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I just wanted to say hi. I hope, I can't really see who is online. I think the speaker should be online. Oh, there you are. And I see Mia. Excellent. That is the main person here. Hi, Mia. Sorry you can't be here. But let me then turn it over to you to run the session and welcome everybody on Zoom. So in the room, we have a lot of people, but we can all hear what you say. So the one
Perfect.
challenge for you is going to be, how do you actually see who wants the floor in the room?
Well, I think I do have a process for that because I did ask. And just to say right away, what I won't see is who is actually raising their hand to put a question. So it would be great if the person who have a question also say their name.
Okay.
Also for the audience who's online or who will be online later on YouTube.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent.
So,
thanks.
Bernard, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of the conference. And it's a great honor to be the chair of this session. And I must say, it's really a treat to be able to learn so much from what I've heard in the different sessions. And you know, being a person who not been involved in actual research for a long time, but with a background as chair for the Aid for Trade negotiations, which is, you know, 15, 16 years back. But anyway, so I'm really appreciating it. And this last session, we will focus on investment, trade, and non-trade objectives. Mattia Di Obaldo and Hugo Rojas Romagosa, we talk on that subject. And we will also have a presentation on research on EU governance of labor standards through trade after that. And Timeo Pal will present on that issue. So each presenter will have about 20 minutes for the presentations, and we will have time for Q&A in connection to that for each presentation afterwards. So with that said, I want to give the floor to Mattia Di Obaldo, who is a research fellow in economics at the University of Sussex Business School and a fellow of UK Trade Policy Observatory. And you will present a paper on non-trade provisions in trade agreements and FDIs. And so with that, I give you the floor. You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Mia. And let me also thank Bernard for putting this together and well, for running the project so well over the years. I'm going to share my screen, so hopefully you will be able to see my slides. How does this work? Okay. Oh, okay, so I'll give you a quick overview of this study that Michael Gaziorek and I did for Respect. And it's, as Mia said, on the impact of non-trade provisions in trade agreements on the flow of bilateral FDI. Now, as has already been mentioned several times during the various sessions of the conference, and you're all aware of, PTAs have become increasingly complex instruments of integration. And more recently, they have also increasingly featured provisions on these non-trade related issues that we can sort of group in civil political rights, economic social rights, and environmental protection. The EU has in particular made a rather big deal about these provisions, and for instance, human rights provisions have been included as essential elements in all its trade agreements since 1995. These essential elements are could potentially be important because the violations of human rights provisions could lead to the suspension or termination of a PTA. Now, this has never applied so far, and I don't see this happening anytime soon. However, these provisions keep being added to trade agreements, for instance, also in the recent EU-UK trade agreement. So what we want to do in this paper is to study their effect on an economic outcome. So we look at the flow of bilateral greenfield FDI in this paper. We don't look at the impact of these provisions on their stated objective. The reason why we look at FDI is because non-trade issues, or NTIs as I'll call them, if they end up affecting a country's level of regulation in a certain area, such as labor standards or environmental protection, could potentially have an impact on FDI, which could be of either sign. It could be negative if those FDI that are stimulated by asymmetries in domestic regulations are deterred by stronger commitments on, as I said, labor or environmental protection. if these provisions end up increasing multinationals' operation costs. On the other side, we might think of these non-trade issues having a positive impact on investment if they create a safer business environment. This could be because there's been progress on governance, stronger institutions. These are quite sort of well-known arguments. There may also be no impact whatsoever if these non-trade issues' main function is to prevent the worsening of certain minimum standards, or they just don't translate into any credible commitment. Now, we want to therefore look at this relation of non-trade issues and FDI in a sort of purely empirical setting. And to do that, we take, these are basically the main sources of data that we use for our analysis. For the FDI, we have access to the Financial Times FDI Markets database. This provides us with what we believe being a rather reliable count of all the greenfield investment projects worldwide. I'm talking about a count because the value of the investment is unfortunately not is not there, or is information which is not there for many of the investment flows. So we basically rely on the number of investment projects. But the data set is quite extensive. As you can see, there's about 172 destinations, 147 sources, and also rather long time period. The rather more novel aspect in terms of data is the data set on the non-trade issue content of trade agreements. Now, you will have seen in recent years a few of these, or a few other data sets as well that have been released that would, provide information on the type of provisions that are included in trade agreements, including non-trade issues. Now, the reason why we picked the data by Lisa Lechner is because this data set provides a legalization score. It goes beyond identifying the presence of a provision in, say, labor standards, but it basically characterizes the agreement in a much more richer way, because the legalization score is defined across 3 dimensions of obligation, delegation, and precision. So we can come up with a score of legalization in civil and political rights, economic and social rights, and environmental protection. Then, so the remaining sources of data that we have access to are, we take the TESTA database for preferential trade agreements, and we control for the presence of bilateral investment treaty, and this information comes from the UNCTAD. Before going to the sort of results of our analysis, this is just a picture to show you this increasing legalization of trade agreements in non-trade issues. And I can be very quick here because this has been discussed at length in this conference, just to show you that, we see this also in this data set that we're using, that the legalization in economic and social rights and environmental protection, for instance, is remarkably higher in agreements that entered into force in the last decade compared to the previous years. This other slide shows you basically the data that we have on the left-hand side. This is the number of investment projects over the time period of observation. Here we have 4 categories that come from grouping the flows depending on their direction. We have grouped countries or labeled countries as north countries for if there are high-income countries, and the rest is the south, so middle and low-income countries. And you can see that most of the investment we work with are between high-income countries. The second largest category are investment flowing from the north to the south, with the lowest number of investment for south-south and south-north investment. Although most of the action in the econometrics you will see will come from this investment directed to middle and low-income countries. In terms of method, and I'm going to spend much time here, we apply a relatively standard model. This is a gravity model, sort of in the spirit of a structural gravity model. So it's relatively rigorous. We have the number, as I mentioned, of investment projects on the left-hand side, and as the main explanatory factor is legalization of PTAs in these non-trade issues. Then we control for a set of sort of pair-wise time-varying policy variables to make sure we pick up the impact of these non-trade issues in a possibly unbiased way. We control for the overall depth of the agreement, the presence of an bilateral investment treaty, and the presence of an investment chapter in the PTA. Well, we also have a dummy for EU pairs. And then you have the sort of usual host of fixed effects here that you want to see in these applications at the country pair and country time level. These are destination time, origin time fixed effects. A couple of features of our empirical method is that we try to proxy for internal investment flows. We perform a variety of robustness checks, changing the aggregation of our left-hand side variable. We use yearly data, but also sort of averages to smooth the volatility of investments over time. We use the lags of the policy variables to allow for some phasing in effect of trade agreements. And also these, we play with various lengths to make sure we're not picking up a particular effect, which is one set of lags. And we also adopt quite a conservative clustering of the standard errors. Now, let me go into the results. So we have a bit more time then to maybe interpret what we find. From this table, which summarizes our main finding, you can see that the impact or most of the coefficients I'm showing in this table are negative. So here I'm showing just the coefficient on this variable for non-trade issues, which has been used separately for economic and social rights, environmental protection, and civil and political rights. In the first column, you can see that the impact of the, each of these provisions or each of the legalization of PTAs in each of these areas has a negative effect on the flow of FDI. The impacts are sort of more precisely estimated for economic and social rights and for civil and political rights, less so for environmental protection. And roughly the same picture is obtained if we estimate these models on a subsample of manufacturing FDI. If we disaggregate the effects depending on the direction of the flow, so whether the flow is between north-north countries or south-south countries and so on, we find that most of the negative effect is driven by investment between south-south countries, or more sort of in general investment directed to low and middle income countries, in particular for these economic and social rights provisions. The impacts are less sort of clear-cut sort of on the environmental protection provisions, but also there we see this south-south dimension being driving the negative impact of these provisions on FDI. For civil and political rights, the negative effect is more or less across all the various groups of FDIs, except the south-north dimension. I would like to point this out because we were really not expecting any negative effect on investment going from, say, low middle income country to the high income countries. And in fact, we do not estimate a negative impact on neither of the provisions that I have, in our analysis. I would leave this now here, and maybe we come back later to the results for some interpretation. The next and second, basically, slide of results I would like to show you is this one here. We try to characterize a little bit differently our results, which we thought, what if the results we're getting could be driven by a country's overall sort of level of regulation in a certain area, and in particular, this negative impact might be driven by the difference between the origin and the destination country in their sort of level of regulation in these areas. So the way we try to proxy for a country's level of regulation, say in economic and social rights, is by using the, again, NTI legalization score. So we aggregate the NTI legalization score across all the agreements a country is a member of, so basically with third parties, except the country pair under analysis, and we construct something that we call the stock of non-trade issues for a certain country. And then we take the difference between the destination and the origin and explore whether the effect differs by different quartiles of the distribution of this stock of NTIs, or the difference in the stock of NTIs. What we find substantially is that all of the negative impact is driven by country pairing the first quartile, and this first quartile are country pairs which differ the most in their overall sort of NTI commitment or the stock of NTIs, and this is where the destination has a lower stock of NTI than the origin country. So it seems to be investment flowing from countries with overall higher commitment on NTIs two countries with the lowest commitment of NTIs that are more deterred by these provisions in trade agreements. So bringing this to a bit of a conclusion, we find that this non-trade issue legalization is associated with a lower number of inward FDI. The impact is relatively robust in our analysis across various model permutation. We find this to be particularly driven by investment directed to middle and low-income countries. Now, for economic and social rights and environmental protection provisions, we think these provisions might be deterring FDI to countries with laxer regulation. If in particular, when the FDI flows from stricter to laxer regulation countries. So these provisions might end up harming, if you want, one of the sources of comparative advantage of low and middle income countries. For civil and political rights provision, the negative impact could be a bit counterintuitive, although it has been observed that multinationals tend to prefer sometimes countries with lower levels of democracy and civil liberties, once their property rights are protected. So the negative impact we estimate could also on CPR provisions could also be deterring FDI for reason as I just mentioned. Now, broadening a little bit the interpretation of our finding, it is known that cost-reducing investment could be stimulated by regulation asymmetries, and countries have been seen to competitively undercut each other's standards to attract foreign capital in a race to the bottom. So in negotiation, especially a sort of north-south negotiation where you have countries such as the EU and the US on one side, these sort of bigger trade partners could be pushing and have been seen to push towards an alignment of standards and regulations. So we see these non-trade issues as something that could help to close the regulatory gap between countries at various level of development. So these non-trade issues, so we would never argue that an unhappy conclusion of this study should could be that non-trade issues are harmful and they shouldn't be included in trade agreements. We don't believe that. But we also seem to find that these non-trade provisions are more than a simple decoration of trade agreements. So if they are effective at achieving their stated objective, and this is a big if, there is a trade-off that needs to be considered, and that is that these provisions could deter some investment, especially those directed to developing countries. Thank you. I will stop here.
Thank you. Thank you. That was really interesting. And just one question for me before I let the floor ask the questions.
Sure.
I was wondering, I mean, have you presented or have you talked to multinationals, the investors, in terms of your findings? I mean, I'm talking about also if you look at it from the other side on the corporate social responsibility kind of angle, you have growing pressure on companies to actually care about these things. So you would actually suspect that maybe over time this would have a different direction. Obviously, it hasn't, according to your findings.
Yes, well, I'm sorry, this is a bit of an unhappy conclusion, I mean, what we're getting at, but I did present this work at a World Economic Forum Council a few weeks back. And the reaction from some of the representative multinationals was actually quite, I would say that they really believed what we were finding, because for them, these non-trade issues are a cost. And this is, according to them, something that is not being stressed enough, clearly, in the sort of ongoing discourse. But they tended to, they saw themselves quite well in this picture. It's clearly something they are asked to comply with, but it might reduce some of their activity. This was an extraction company, I think, so they might be particularly affected by environmental provisions, and so maybe one ideal extension of this work would be to do this distinguishing across different sectors and activities of multinationals, but so far the data didn't allow us to do that.
Thank you. So now let me see if there's someone who wants to ask a question, either online or in Florence. It doesn't, I don't see any signs that there is. Oh, here I see the villa, please.
Let me take. Thanks a lot. A very interesting presentation. Just one more clarification question. What's the control group again that you compare those negative estimates with? So that's relative to north-north, because that's quite important in the interpretation, I guess, of the
This
effects.
is right. So in the control group, there are countries that do not have agreements with non-trade issues. There are the so-called internal investment flows, and well, what we're picking up here is also a marginal effect, to be more precise. So this is what we have here is sort of elasticity that we're estimating. You know, we're getting at an increasing number of non-trade issues being reducing the flow of FDIs. But it is relative to countries that do not have NTIs in their agreements and internal investment flows, as far as I can tell.
Okay, could I ask you one more question? Here I see Bernard. I think it's Bernard. Please, you start.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that relates to, I think, another paper, right? So I remember there was another paper that you guys, I think it was, I think it was you guys that looked at the impact of FDI on these non-trade outcomes, right? And what I recall from that paper, that there was actually a positive relationship between more FDI leading to improvement in some of these non-trade indicators, right? So I guess the question is, how does the current paper relate to that finding?
Thanks, Bernard. I'm not sure I have written such a paper.
Okay, so there's too many papers in this project.
Well, we try to make sure we're not picking up this reverse causality with the sort of fixed effect structure from an econometric point of view and the use of these lags in the policy variables that we try to sort of. But I'm actually sorry. I mean, I would like to also read this paper that you just mentioned. I mean, I can't remember honestly the opposite side, the opposite story. But yeah, all I can say is that we're hopefully confident that our results are unbiased from that point of view. Yes, I think Jacques is showing either interest in a question or they've written the paper that Bernard is referring to.
Okay, I see there's another question.
No, it's linked. It's linked to this. It's linked to this. Jacques Pelkmans. So there is quite a lot of literature saying that when multinationals invest in, let's say, developing countries, their status, the way they operate, is much higher than the level of regulation would force them to do. So how do you reconcile that with this? And the second issue is not really a question, but is my reservation. You use FDI flows, which are extremely volatile and unreliable. Maybe you have no choice, but if you had a choice, I would use FDI stocks. But the first question is really my main. I don't understand, because that literature is very wide and also comes from business schools, everything.
Thank you very much. It is true that some multinationals claim to be operating above the standards that are required. What I can say is we seem to be picking up these effects from investment directed to low and middle income countries, especially when the South-South dimension seems to be particularly driving these negative effects. So it might well be that certain multinationals do not operate above the standards, or it's hard to say. We don't really observe the level of standards that these multinationals comply with. I know your point is definitely a good, correct one and well taken. On the flows, we try to average our FDI data to sort of smooth a bit is volatility over time, sort of 3-year averages of these FDI flows. It doesn't seem to make a difference to our estimates. So, I mean, yeah, I think that would be my answer about the volatility of FDI.
So is there another question?
Oh, no, that's another question. It's just an answer to him. It's true that if you look, for example, at China, which we did in great detail, Chinese investments in Africa are notoriously what you call in the bad category. And there's a lot of literature, even by Chinese. That document is in very great detail. And it's not 2 or 3 papers. It's more like 40 papers. You know, it's really in various industries. So if you indeed, yeah, I had in mind OECD originated FDI. That's true. And maybe that is where the difference is.
Sorry, I have a question from Florence, Matteo Fiorini.
Please.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to point to the paper that probably you had in mind, Bernard. So this is the piece by Beata and co-authors, where they look at an Indonesian firm level data, and they show that foreign ownership is associated with a lower energy intensity. So this is a micro level evidence that FDI indeed is contributing to this specific non-trade objective. But I think, you know, in the same way as Joe, Francois, and Miriam were discussing yesterday, the exercise of looking at the relationship between trade and non-trade objectives, would be nicely to see the same application across different objectives for the FDI. So FDI on the right hand side, and on the left hand side the measures of non-trade outcomes.
So there was one more question in the room I saw. No? No, okay.
I have a question. I'm sorry.
Please.
I was trying to signal it online. It's a really interesting presentation, Mattia. I was wondering if, given that the legal sanctions are not used anyway to address labor concerns or social concerns, to what extent do you think it's really important to differentiate between the PTAs according to this legalization score, or is it just enough to differentiate based on the inclusion of labor provisions? You will see why I asked this question since we used a different database in our analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So from an empirical point of view, the sort of simple inclusion of labor provisions in PTAs, we didn't go for that because almost all the agreements in our database have some provisions. So being able to use a continuous variable that characterizes a bit how many or how strong these provisions are, we thought was the better way to go. So that would be one type of answer. Then whether they're actually enforced or not is something we can't tell also from our data. But I found it interesting that even just by looking at this increasing legalization seems to be deterring the investment flow. There must be something there that multinationals react to. Also, we have maybe I should stress this more, the number of investment projects on the left-hand side. So we're not talking about the value of the investment. So there might be indeed very small investments that are, that are deterred by these provisions. I mean, maybe the big multinationals are not going to be scared off. This is something we can't check in our data.
So thank you. I do have a question from Julian Hintz here. And then that would be the last question before we go on. Please.
I already asked my question before. So
oh, sorry.
I don't think there's...
Sorry, Julia. I don't know the names here. So that's fine. Could I then just end with a last question for myself? How has it been received by policymakers, this finding? And has there been any kind of policy implication discussions?
I'm afraid I don't know. We haven't had much interaction, about this particular finding with policymakers. Yeah, sorry, I can't answer this question.
Okay, no, that's to come, I suppose, and also further research according to what being proposed here. So thank you very much. And let me now turn to the second speaker, Hugo Roches Ramogas from the World Bank. And you will talk on how trade and investment agreements affect bilateral foreign direct investments, and also to present some from the paper on effects of non-trade provisions in trade and FDIs, agreements on bilateral FDIs. So with that, please, Mattia, the floor is yours.
You go, I guess. Yeah, thank you for the
Oh,
introduction.
sorry,
And,
sorry.
And for the invitation to present. I was asked to present this paper that relates preferential trade agreements with FDI flows, which is a paper that I did with Hank Cox and has been published last year in the World Economy. As a complement to that paper, probably, I mean, would have been a bit more appropriate as the paper I did for Respect, which was within that context and using the same kind of data we had in the methodology we had for that previous paper that we looked at the non-trade policy objectives. So I will kind of go through the first paper because it uses the same FDI data and the same methodology that we used for the second paper, and I will briefly touch upon the second paper. Just to link a bit with the paper with Mattia, I think he mentioned at the end, which is really important, that they use data that has the count of number of greenfield projects per year. And the data we use, because we have different results, it's the value of stocks. Well, we have stocks inflows, but we usually mainly use stocks of basically all investments. Of course, the thing with FDI is that, there are several issues with this data, and also, I mean, it's not readily available, but I will touch upon that later on. So, I mean, just to keep that in mind when I present the results of the second paper. So what we did in the first paper was look at basically trade policy effects on FDI stocks, bilateral FDI stocks. And for this, we also use a structural gravity model. And we want to ask basically those three questions. What is the impact first of PTAs on the depth of PTAs on FDI, bilateral FDI? If that's important, which components of those PTAs are the ones incentivizing FDI? And can we say something about vertical versus horizontal FDI? And as I mentioned before, and we have different control. We also use a score of fixed effects and control for EU membership, and we also look at bilateral investment treaties there and some other trade investment policy indicators. And then using the same FDI data, the same depth of PTA data, we include the NTMPOs to see what are the effects of those on bilateral FDI. Well, this presentation was really more for a bit longer session we had initially, so I will skip through some of the slides. So there's quite some literature on effects of gravity models that use FDI, and the ranges from simple kind of adapting the trade framework of gravity to FDI. And more recently, there have been more complex general equilibrium models that look at the relationship between trade, FDI, economic growth, and other variables. And this paper is more, what we do is we use more a partial equilibrium focusing on the FDI effects on just bilateral. So we don't look at the interactions between FDI, trade, and so we kind of just concentrate the model. It's a partial equilibrium model. And then there are different, different theories between the relations between PTAs and FDI. So the most, generalized form of it will be that if you have a vertical FDI, that will be complementary to more, more trade and as such more if you have a PTA that will incentivize not only trade but also FDI. On the other hand, if you have horizontal FDI, when you're kind of substituting for trade, then you'll have the inverse effect. So then PTIs will expect to reduce investments instead of increasing it. The problem we have here, as I mentioned before, is that FDI data it's not the best data and it's hard to compile. So we cannot distinguish between horizontal and vertical FDA. So that's one limitation from the data. Yeah, as I mentioned before, we go for this partial equilibrium model. And also we don't include trade-offs because there's some endogeneity issues between FDI and trade, which are kind of the same causal process. And then we want to look at, if it's a difference between just having a PTA or if the depth of the PTA makes it's important or not. And this model is mostly close related to this Anderson, Larch, and Jotov paper that was published in 2019. The differences is that we focus in the standalone FDI gravity model, and they use more a general equilibrium where they include trade as well. They go for more, trying to explain welfare effects. We focus more on FDI patterns, and there are a couple of other effects differences with that paper. And part of what we want to distinguish is the absolute access barriers and also relative barriers. And for this, we use different variables and techniques in the paper. I'm not gonna kind of skip through this. Also through the equation, so it's a kind of a standard FDI application to a trade model. So it looks very similar to what a trade gravity model would be, but we try to adjust that to reflect FDI. And again, here we also follow kind of the standard of gravity practices. One thing that we found that extremely important is to control for domestic capital stock to distinguish effects of non-discriminatory trade policy and investments. And if we don't include this, basically results change a lot. And this is the gravity specification. It looks very similar to what Mattia said, so that we have a host of fixed effects, and then we have the policy variables, which in our case is going to be we also use the DESTA PTA depth indicator. We also use the World Bank PTA indicators, at least the previous version of that database. And we also have include there, for example, the beats and other trade and investment indicators. Now, the FCA data that we're using now, it comes from the UNCTAD global database. And this is, well, it's for many countries, under 6 countries. The span is a bit more limited, 2001, 2012. And another exercise, well, another consultancy we did for the bank, we complemented that data with OECD and IMF data. And I know now that there's a unit in the bank that's working on compiling this, the different sources. So they're compiling UNCTAD data because UNCTAD data already is using information from central banks and IMF. So UNCTAD is also kind of, a compilation of different data sources. So hopefully, well, I haven't heard from this for some months, but we will get this more, compiled database that it will provide better more recent information, because as you can see, our database stops in 2012. And when we include OECD and IMF, I think we could include until 2015. The other thing is this, well, we have both stocks and flows. We focus mainly on the stocks because it's more stable, and then there's also issues with flow data. And we made some small adjustments of this data that you can find in the paper. And for the policy indicators, we want to distinguish between shallow and deep because it's been proven to be important. We use a DESTA database, but we also use the World Bank database to try to have some robustness there. And then the bilateral investment treaty data we get from the UNCTAD. We also make some adjustments to the DESTA database, and I'm going to go into that. And our main results, well, this is a table, but I will go through a bit more interpretations. So what we find is that if you have, if you sign a PTA agreement, you're going to have positive effects that is around 31%. So if you use like a PTA dummy, your FDI stock will increase about 30%. If you have the deepest trade agreement, which in the DESTA database there's an index from 1 to 7. So if you have, an agreement that qualifies at an index of 7 in DESTA, you will have 35%. So it's not really a big difference between just signing an agreement and signing the deepest agreement. And we also find that the main driver well, the biggest effects is to become a new member. So here you have very large increases for FDI. You'll expect, right? If you become a member to the EU, then it's not. And what we argue in the paper is that that's much more than preferred agreement, because you have the different laws and institutions that you belong to, and there we have increases. I think that's 140% of the stock of FDI. But in any case, it's really important to account for this, because most of the, around 70% of the PTAs that are deep are including new members. Then when we have a bit looking at the different components of the FDI, the different depth levels, we find that basically, if you take away the EU single market, as you don't account it like a PTA of depth 7, then having these deep agreements and not being part of the EU is not really significant. So it's much more, and most of the provisions are, if you regress them individually with a different, or if you regress them individually, they're usually significant. And this was a bit surprising because, for example, part of those 7 provisions are in DESTA. One is investment, and investment, was as significant, or the magnitude was even lower than other provisions. And this can be also, it can just be, doesn't mean that some of those provisions are not creating FDI. It just can be the way that it's measured on this. And there's also something that we try to address in the paper. But the main result we find is that, it's just signing agreements, regardless of the depth, will increase your FDI. When we do the bid, so we find that it does have a positive impact effect on bilateral FDI. And the effect is slightly bit higher than the PTA. And one of the conclusions was to find that it doesn't make a difference between the UNCTAD data. You can distinguish the bids that are in force and the ones that are just signed. And we find that, having a bid that's in force has a magnitude that's a bit larger, but it's not significantly different from just having the signed. And one important thing is that kind of countries that have a PTA usually bids kind of a different, there's not much correlation between having a bid and a PTA. So it kind of addresses different issues. So when you have a PTA, you also have more trade relationships. What bid is a bit more like, when you don't have so much relationship, it's more to assure kind of protect, property rights and other more basic investment assurances in the home country. We go through another, it's kind of part of more the sensitivity, so I'm not going to go much into this, but we also test other policy variables. And in general, you have the more integration you have, the more you include your property. Sorry, was there a question? Okay, probably it's just an echo. And then as part of the sensitivity as well, we use the World Bank depth indicators. We have very similar results. We also use different averages, 2, 3, 4 year averages of FDI stocks to try to smooth the series. We also use the FDI flows. And here well, we only find that it's only significant when we have 4-year averages, and this because the flows are really volatile. So you're picking up a lot of other macroeconomic and yearly conditions there. But in general, results are quite robust to the sensitivity checks. We also exclude tax havens, for example. So some countries that probably you're not, there are in the UNCTAD data, but they're probably not picking FDI, but just some other kind of FDI that is not really going to those countries, but it will be then redirected to other countries. Okay, and just to conclude, to go to a close. So what we did for the NTPOs, and this was the project I did for Respect, or one of the parts I did, was that I used the same FDI data, the same PTA data, and then I linked this with Lisa Lechner's NTPO indicators, and Mattia already discussed about this. So it's covering broadly 3 types of NTIs. And what we find is that the NTA provisions, if any, they have positive relation with bilateral FDI. So the civil and political right index is positive, significant, and it's quite robust to the different specifications we have. While the other 2, the economic and social rights and environmental protection, they're usually positive coefficients, but they're not robust to different specifications. And this is another paper that I think is going to be published as a chapter of, I don't know, I have to ask Matteo, knows better. I think Matteo and or Miriam were editing that paper, that book. But here, I mean, it's quite different results from Mattia found, and I mean, we had discussed this before, and it's just different data that we're using. So it just gives different kind of perspective on the different relationships. So here we're talking more about stocks, and there's the value of those stocks over time. So it can be, it's a bit different from having new greenfield projects on a yearly basis. And this is the conclusions, but I think I went through that already. So yeah, I will stop here.
Thank you. Hello.
Hello, yes?
I hear you, Hugo, but I can't hear the others.
We are here.
Oh, great. Maybe you should close down your there we are. Great. Thank you. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, and also it was really interesting to have these in combination with Mattia. One issue which kind of came to my mind just listening to you was, and I can't remember actually the timing and the dates of your data, Mattia, because as you showed, the increase of the number of non-trade objectives has increased over time. So could that be something that would explain some, at least be important in looking at also the bilateral FDIs?
This is actually an interesting point. Our data span a bit longer time period than Hugo's. So we go 5 years more. I think we have up to 2017 relative to 2012, and there was a marked increase in NTIs after that. We could simply try and check whether trimming our data would give us different results. But I do believe, as Hugo said, that most of the difference probably lies in the use of very different FDI data, stock versus flows, and values versus count of projects. But I think that's a useful point. We'll check that.
So, questions? I can see some hands up, not who it is. Please ask a question and say who you are.
Julian Hinz. I was rather surprised by the results or your interpretation of the results, that just a PTA itself is is just as important as a deep PTA, if I did not misunderstand. And so isn't the interpretation the exact reverse, that the effect that you're measuring for an FTA, no matter how deep, is driven almost entirely by the deep FTA PTAs?
No, not really, because mainly they're not, if you take away EU countries, there are not many deep PTAs. So there's not, outside of the EU, what is defined as a deep PTA, there are not many signed there. So usually it's, so that's not explaining that. But again, it's a bit with this, I would just say that, it's hard to distinguish the different provisions on the DESTA. The World Bank, on the other hand, it has, you see a bit more relationship between the debt and the difference between going with more provisions than just having the average PTA. But again, the thing is there's more interpretation, because the World Bank database, at least the one we worked with a couple of years ago, it had 52 provisions, and there you can, it's just broader. And then you can, we didn't do that, going provision by provision to see which one was driving the results. So that's something that, you can look deeper into, and as well, how this is classified. I think there's also work at, that's on the World Bank on trying to go deeper in what these provisions imply. And if they're adding something, because what I understand, for example, there are many of these provisions that are just there in the PTA, but it doesn't really add anything to what it's already in place, at the country level, or that will really facilitate more trade or more FDI. So, that's quite a field of research that can still be explored. But what we find is, different. It doesn't, both at the World Bank and the DESTA, using those PTA databases, you don't see significant differences between having more provisions and just signing an average PTA.
Thanks.
Thank you. I had a question from Alan Winters on YouTube. Here it comes. Stocks surely depend on causes over the previous decade or so. What lag structures do you have in your results? Please.
Yeah, so we use different averages. So we use the stock averages for 2, 3, 4 years, and we use that in combination with I think up to 2 to 3 lags and also lead. So we go back and forth, and the results don't change that much. There's some changes in the magnitude, but in significance and the direction of the results are more or less the same.
Thank you. Questions? I don't see a question. Let's see, I see something here on my chat. Question from Michael Geiserek on YouTube. If you run the regression with just the PTA dummy variables, do you get sizable positive coefficients for non-EU PTAs?
Yeah, that's kind of the main result, that if you use this this average, which is the dummy, using the dummy variable of PTA, just as the average PTA, we have, the magnitude of the effect on bilateral stocks is similar to having the deeper PTAs.
Okay, thank you. So I don't see any more questions at this time. So thank you very much. And we now turn to the second issue we have to discuss in this session. And that is the prospects and limitation of promoting labor standards through the European neighborhood policy, and also the role of domestic factors in the EU governance of labor standards through trade. And Timea Powell will be the one presenting the key findings, and co-author Franklin Maduku, who is now with us here, will join in the Q&A part. So Timea Powell, as you all know, is a researcher affiliated with the Center for International Studies at the University Institute of Lisbon. Please, Timea, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, Mia. Just a minute, let me set up my slides here. Is everyone able to see the slides in full view?
Yes.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's a great honor to conclude the series of presentations with a synthesis and summary of some of the key findings emerging from the research that my colleagues Franklin Maduko and Laszlo Brust and myself have conducted in the framework of this project, looking at the ability of the EU to promote labor standards through its trade policy. So unfortunately, we were not able to come to be here in person, but Franklin will join me during the Q&A session to address some of the comments and questions that will come up. So what I would like to do first is to give a brief overview of some of the main research outcomes coming out from the work that we have done, and then proceed to a discussion about how we got to them and provide some additional details. So our empirical analysis indicates that overall, the expansion of trade is associated with a deterioration of labor standards among developing countries that can be attributed to the intensification of economic competition that reinforces the comparative advantage of developing countries in producing low-cost labor-intensive products. We also found that two EU-related governance mechanisms can mitigate to some extent this negative influence with their distinct advantages and disadvantages. The first one consists of the promotion of labor standards through formal trade policy. And by trade policy, we understand trade agreements, but also their accompanying measures. We find that these facilitated reforms in fundamental labor rights, albeit even in its most ambitious form, that in our case was represented by the European Neighbourhood Policy, and I will explain later. So even when it did facilitate reforms, the progress has taken place primarily at the formal level and in relatively few areas. The second mechanism was the result of the expansion of trade to EU member states with superior labor standards and higher industrial sophistication that under some conditions that again we will explain later on resulted in improvements in working conditions at a more practical level, although benefiting workers benefiting primarily workers who are more skilled and less vulnerable in these supply chains. So our research was very much informed by this ongoing division in the literature that identifies two alternative pathways through which trades can facilitate harmonization with international or EU standards. The first one refers to the design and implementation of formal trade policies with an emphasis on the inclusion of labor provisions, stipulations regarding the stringency of conditionality, and very importantly, the use of accompanying support measures that at least in the area, at least in the literature on labor standards, are the instruments that are associated with effectiveness. So we refer to this approach in this presentation as state-led regulatory governance, given the important role of governments and of international cooperation. The other mechanism refers to market-based dynamics that accompany greater trade integration. Perhaps most notably, this includes the literature that examines the conditions under which expansion of exports to large end markets with high standards result in upward convergence, the so-called California, or in later adaptations, the Brussels effect. But it also includes, it extends to supply chain governance mechanism that can be complementary to the California or Brussels effect in the area of labor standards. So these two alternative pathways are obviously interconnected, as trade agreements often lead to an expansion of trade relations and strengthen the supply chain linkages, but they refer to rather different actors, different processes, and have different policy implications. And as such, they constituted the focus of two different papers. Some of the key research questions guiding our work were: what effect does the EU trade policy have on labor standards among developing countries? Through which pathways is it more equipped to exert a positive influence? And what role, if any, do domestic factors have in mediating its effect? So while part of the analysis has a broader geographical scope in that we look at developing countries with EU agreements in general, we have used the European neighborhood policy as the primary empirical window to approach some of these questions. And this is because while the ENP builds on the legal and institutional basis of bilateral agreements, since its launch in 2004, on one hand, it reinforced the EU's commitments to promote a series of NTPOs with respect to its neighboring countries. And on the other hand, it also resulted in a significant upgrading in the accompanying measures. So ENP conditionality introduced the possibility of deeper trade integration based on reforms across a series of policy sectors. It also resulted in a deepening of bilateral dialogue whereby new subcommittees were established to focus cooperation, to encourage cooperation on specific issue areas. Action plans were negotiated to set benchmarks and guide reforms, and regular assessments was initiated to evaluate the extent of progress achieved. Finally, the ENP also entailed a significant expansion in both financial and technical assistance relative to what has been there before. So as such, we consider the ENP to constitute a critical case of EU trade policy or market access-based policy that can shed greater light on the prospects and limitations of the ability of the EU to promote NTPOs through its trade strategy. In the empirical analysis, we use the combination of regression and comparative case analysis. The regression analysis served primarily to identify associations between the key variables. Labor standards were assessed through the SIRI Worker Protection Index, that is an aggregate measure of labor rights and working conditions ranging from 0 to 2. It's a rather rough measure, but it is commonly used in labor studies. And independent variables included a classification of type of trade policies of the EU that built on a previous work by Bastians and Postnikov. And this distinguished so the resulting variable distinguished among the ENP, EU trade agreements in force with labor provisions and other EU trade agreements. The independent variables also included the composition of exports and a measure of workers' rights in key export destinations for the more market-based dynamics. The comparative case study of Morocco and Moldova, on the other hand, served to examine the processes underpinning these associations identified in the regression analysis, to shed more light on the specific labor standards affected by them. So in a way to get beyond this aggregate assessment of labor standards and understand better the role of domestic factors. So through the analysis, we found that the ENP did contribute to an improvement in labor standards as measured by the SIRI indicator that extended beyond the positive influence of EU trade agreements of labor standards in general that has already been discussed and identified as a mechanism in existing studies. So here we show some of the coefficients associated with our key independent variables along with the negative coefficient of the trade intensity. The existence of a causal link was confirmed by the case studies, as we found that the governments of both Morocco and Moldova have repeatedly sought to align their national regulations with international and in some cases EU standards as part of the ENP action plans. But the qualitative study also revealed that the improvements consisted primarily in these legal and formal regulatory reforms in the areas of abolition of child labor, non-discrimination, and occupational health and safety, but without significant change at the implementation level that could be attributed to the ENP or in other areas. We attributed this outcome to an implementation approach that is selective in scope and places weak emphasis on domestic capacity building. We found that given a relatively low importance attached to labor standards by the EU relative to other policy objectives, so going back to those discussions about the trade-offs that the EU has to make, EU efforts to promote labor standards took place predominantly in the framework of interstate dialogue, where EU officials used a combination of pressure and persuasion to encourage their counterparts to meet the commitments included in the ENP action plans and address problems identified through the assessment reports. These efforts focused primarily on those labor standards that were consistent with other major policy objectives pursued by the EU. So for example, they focus predominantly on fundamental labor rights as part of the EU's human rights agenda, and on social dialogue that I will come back to in the next slide. But working condition standards that one could argue that conflict with greater market integration, as a lot of European multinationals have outsourced or offshored parts of their production to the neighboring countries, have been largely overlooked. The only exception in this regard was occupational health and safety that acquired greater importance over the past years. And finally, the financial and technical assistance provided by the EU also has not really prioritized labor standards. When it did provide assistance to state agencies responsible for labor regulation, this focused primarily on the state institutions and have been insufficient to address the major shortcomings in this regard among the neighboring countries. So this shallow dialogue-based implementation approach had two major limitations. The first one was to incentivize reforms primarily at the formal level that were more reportable in these progress assessments and in these bilateral interactions, and were also more compatible with the legalistic approach of the state officials involved. The other major limitation was that even at this formal level, the EU was not able to address areas of concern where resistance by neighboring countries' governments was strong. So even after years of EU pressure, for example, the Moroccan government has still not ratified ILO Convention on Freedom of Association. Actually, the extent of reform in collective labor rights has been very limited in both countries. The extent of EMP-led improvements was furthermore greatly constrained by the persistence of weak state capacity in most countries, in addition to shortages of labor inspectors and resources at their disposal that obviously hindered implementation to a significant degree. This limitation was also manifest in the fact that a significant part of the workforce remained in the informal sector, so the state was not able to incorporate them in the formal economy. Contrary to our initial expectation, however, labor organizations actually did not really play an important mediating role. The ILO, the International Labour Organization, and domestic organizations in some contexts have been active to improve implementation of national regulation and to seek upward harmonization. But given the shortcomings of the EMP to engage them in a more substantive, in a more direct way, these have exerted a positive influence largely independently from the EMP. The constraining effect of low state capacity and the inability of labor organizations to complement EU efforts has actually been exacerbated by the intensification of economic competition. As we noted earlier, in the case of Moldova, there was a significant decline in state regulatory capacity that was the result of reforms to reduce regulatory burden and increase competitiveness of the private sector. But also with respect to labor organizations, notwithstanding a significant contribution of the EMP to strengthen social dialogue, the ability of labor unions to influence outcomes has remained very weak, as the state, often in close collaboration with export-oriented sectors or industry associations, came to prioritize economic competitiveness over worker protection. So with respect to market-based influence, our analysis revealed the importance of sectoral composition of exports, with textile and apparel associated with a negative, and automotive and machinery with positive correlations with labor standards, as you can see on this table. These differences were confirmed by the case studies of Moldova and Morocco that expose important differences across the two sectors in the level of wages, the intensity of work, the form and terms of employment that were all superior in the automotive sector. There were indications, however, that resistance against unions were quite common among export-oriented sectors in general. So both sectors were exposed to social sustainability governance of lead firms. These were perhaps even more prominent in the textile and apparel industry, given the higher level of reputational risks involved. but the cost and sourcing pressures have obviously been considerably greater in textile and apparel, posing significant challenges for suppliers from the neighboring countries that were then passed down to the workers. So these findings suggest that the overall negative association between trade intensity and labor standards can be attributed to a great extent to the importance of low-cost labor-intensive production when they integrate deeper with in trade with the EU or the world economy, a dynamic that can change to some extent as developing countries are able to achieve sectoral or other form of industrial upgrading. The second important finding was that labor standards of key end markets did matter for labor standards in developing countries, but this influence did not take place at the EU level as predicted by the Brussels effect, but rather at the EU member state level. And this is not that surprising given the significant differences in national labor regimes within the EU, particularly between old and new member states. What this means is that while export to some EU member states might incentivize reforms at the company, sector, or country level in exporting developing countries, other member states are less likely to exert such a positive influence. This is just the coefficient associated with this variable. This was also substantiated by the comparison across Moldova and Morocco that while exported similar types of products differed considerably in their key destinations. Moldova exported primarily to Romania and Morocco to France and Spain. Export-oriented companies from these two different national jurisdictions were exposed to different cost pressures and social sustainability expectations. In the case of Morocco, there was also more support measures provided by the lead firms and sometimes other organizations from their key destination markets to support industrial upgrading. And the third main finding related to the market-based governance was that in addition to these external incentives and support measures associated with the supply chain linkages with key export markets, the capacity of the state and of domestic industry associations to respond to them also played a very important role in the extent of improvements, giving rise to a semi-virtuous cycle in the case of Morocco and a vicious one in Moldova. The case of Morocco was an illustration of how the industrial policies of the government and of industry associations have facilitated labor upgrading in export-oriented sectors, often in collaboration with lead firm initiatives and other external actors. The benefits to workers, however, accrued primarily to skilled workers employed on more regular contracts and not so much to the more vulnerable, less skilled workers hired on temporary contracts. In the case of Moldova, on the other hand, where economic constraints were much more significant and support measures were largely absent, greater supply chain linkages, in fact, reinforced the competitive strategy based on low costs and regulations by both the state and main exporting firms operating there. So just to conclude, let me just reiterate once more the main conclusion that greater trade integration of developing countries is on average associated with a negative externality on labor standards. EU-related governance mechanisms have important limitations in addressing this problem, and more needs to be done. And as a final note, I will leave you with a few policy recommendations that we thought that might be a good start to address these shortcomings. So we propose a greater effort to be exerted to improve the ability of state and non-state actors to first engage more directly in EU labor governance, but also to achieve industrial upgrading that also benefits workers. We also suggest a broadening of the scope of external labor governance efforts to working conditions and informality, since this really constitutes a very significant part in Moldova and Morocco, constituted around half of the workforce. Given the significant cost pressures that exerted on export-oriented companies from developing countries, particularly from labor-intensive sectors like textile and apparel, we also recommend the EU to require MNEs or encourage them to share the costs of social sustainability and engage in capacity building measures themselves to address problems throughout their supply chains. Finally, we recommend that the EU promotes upward convergence in labor standards within the EU as well to increase effectiveness and maintain a legitimacy when it requires values as part of its trade policies. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very interesting overview of your findings. And I want to open up for questions right away, but just one question before that. On your last note, or one of the last, stating the difference between the two cases you had, what were the drivers behind, the industrial policy and sectoral organizations' views in the Moroccan case? I mean, what drove their positive kind of view on the issues we're discussing?
Yeah, so the argument we are making is that it was really the incentives posed by lead firms and consumers from their key export markets, in this case, France and Spain, where there was an increasing interest on addressing labor standard problems throughout the supply chains that resulted in exports to their markets, and that encouraged initiatives from the state as well as from the firms. So there was a certification initiative launched by the industry association AMIT to respond to these incentives. So it really was, on one part, this external incentive to promote their exports and maintain access to the key main export market. But on the other hand, it was really very clear the difference in terms of their capacity to respond to these incentives, since the Moroccan government has actually been very successful in launching a series of industrial policies. And we were actually very pleasantly surprised by the organizational capacity of the industry association in the textile and apparel sector. They have been involved in a lot of skill training and networking with different organizations. So it was really a combination of external incentives and domestic capacity to respond to those incentives.
Okay, thank you. This connects to, I think, what Bernard said. Two things you've said, both that you need to have compared other type of measures as assistance and connected to these type of trade issues, and also that maybe working with the supply chain connection can actually also improve. So with that said, questions? Maybe also I should let Franklin come in if you have something to add at this point. Please.
No, I don't really have anything to add because I think Timia presented the work in a very concise manner. However, if anyone do have specific questions with respect to our work, I'm happy to jump in. Thank you.
Here I have, let's see, Bernard, please.
Thanks. I have two questions. One of them is purely administrative. So I think if you can come back to me at the end, I'll ask that particular question. But I wanted to ask about the last recommendation, which says, okay, the EU should be raising its own standards. Is that just purely kind of a normative statement in terms of something you guys would like to see? Or did that really come out of some of the case studies and the interactions? So were people in Moldova, Morocco, kind of saying, well, you know, the EU is not exactly pristine here. And, you know, so therefore, we're looking for the EU to actually do a better job at actually doing this inside the EU, because otherwise, you know, there's a lack of credibility for us to actually push this, you know, in our own country. So again, I was just a kind of curiosity in terms of whether that was actually normative or really coming out of the case studies.
No, thank you, Bernard. That's a great question. I think it's not just a simply normative recommendation that we made. I think it connects to the research in two ways. The first way was really that we saw very different dynamics emerging in Moldova and Morocco, The difference being that they were really exporting to different member states, so Romania versus France and Spain. So a lot of besides the differences in labor standards, there were obviously differences also in the industrial sophistication of the companies that they were shipping their products. But I think an important element was that they were just not exposed to such strong incentives to care more about the labor standard issue throughout their operations and their supply chains in their respective domestic context. But it also came out in a different way related to the legitimacy of these requests on behalf of the EU. That was during the conversation with ministry representatives in Morocco, who would point out that there is a great extent of hypocrisy on behalf of the EU, although the examples that they gave was not so much related to labor standards, but actually animal welfare standards. So they were giving the example that in France, you have the foie gras, which requires a method that's very painful for animals, but then on the other hand, there are measures now on the EU's behalf to start asking for animal welfare measures.
Any more questions in the room? Could I then ask you a question? Probably have answered it already, but I mean, in terms of relative importance of so-called harder conditionality versus softer, which relates to assistance and dialogue, what is the relative importance?
Yeah, so
everything else equal.
Yeah, this is a question that we were also very interested in. It guided our thinking throughout the project. And actually we found that while this conditionality and legally binding measures were there to some extent, when it came to using them, the EU, it really relates back to that trade-off issue, that it wasn't really used to promote reforms or to address problems in the labor area. They were used to address concerns in other policy areas that constituted a greater concern for the EU. So, for example, the EU has actually been very innovative in using financial assistance to promote reforms in the area of rule of law. But this has not been really used with respect to labor standards. And actually, neighboring countries learned over time that we saw a diminution of the extent of legal reforms achieved over the years. And one possibility could be that they learned that actually there is no real consequence if they don't conform so much to external expectations. But also with respect to that legally binding measures, it was interesting to see that Moldova, that did sign the DCFTA with the EU in 2014, so in its commitments to reforms became legally binding, while the pace, in Moldova's case, the pace of legal reforms did accelerate. It was not able to stop a significant deterioration in state capacity to regulate labor standards. So there was a reorganization of the labor administrative structure that resulted in a significant decline in its ability to implement reforms. So in general, I think in this area of study on labor standards, there's a recognition that the conditionalities and legally binding measures are not really used to achieve progress. So what has been driving the change are these softer measures like dialogue and assistance, but that bears the question, of course, whether conditionality is necessary at all. And this drives us back a little bit to the presentation by Jacques Bergman yesterday on China and the EU, which was a case where the only platform was really just dialogue, and we did not see much progress emerging, at least on the labor side. There was some element on the environmental part. So while we're not saying that conditionality is not important, I think it's necessary, but certainly not sufficient for promoting progress in these NTPUs.
Thank you. Can I ask you about, just as a last question, this dialogue and also the assistance, how much do you see the need for actually collaborating with business, with companies who actually have their supply chains into these countries? Or is it something that can be driven only by general development assistance, or is it important to have collaboration?
Yeah, definitely collaboration, definitely a multi-stakeholder engagement approach. I think the great limitation thus far was, on one hand, that the priority attached to labor standards was not so important, but on the other hand, that there was this exclusive focus on the state, that there wasn't a significant involvement by other actors. There have been institutional innovations that I think San Bilal brought up just before, but in our conversations, especially with the trade unions and labor organizations, sometimes they were not even aware of the existence of these forums. But I think also in the involvement by the private sector could be encouraged. And yeah, I think it's a great idea that perhaps organizing the dialogue around supply chains would actually create greater results in the end. I agree with you.
Okay, with that, I see that our time is ended. And I know
So Mia,
yeah.
if I can just ask my administrative question. So yesterday we had a brief discussion in terms of outputs and whether currently still unpublished things are going into journals, or whether there's interest in contributing to a final edited volume. So if you guys could think about that, and maybe also discuss with Laszlo, because the work you've presented, obviously some of that will go into journals, but I don't know, maybe not. I mean, that's something for you guys to decide on. But there's also all the work that was done in terms of the code book, the data, etc. So if you could consult internally and kind of come back to us and say, okay, this is something that we could or would want to contribute, or just say, no, forget about it. We're going strictly through journals, etc. So count us out for a final ebook. And I think that what I took away from the discussion yesterday is that instead of a conference volume, kind of a standard academic press, we would go for an ebook, because that will facilitate the dissemination, because that will be available for free. Anyway, if you could think about that and get back to us, that would be great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. I'll leave it to you now, Bernard, for the end.
Oh, I guess, yes. So we have come to the end. Okay, well, I don't have much to say. I think it was a really interesting discussion over the last 2 days. I think it brought home to me again that there are limits to Zoom. So Zoom has great advantages. I see all of you sitting there and you can actually participate without being here. But of course, what you miss is the social interaction, the coffee break discussions, the ideas for new research. So I think this is the first couple of conferences we've done. We've actually had people in the room. So I think it's been very constructive, and I hope we can see all of you in the flesh sooner, if not later. I know that there are things planned in Sussex, so I'm looking forward to that. So thanks again for everybody who came. I know it was a huge hassle for some of you. Traveling nowadays is not as easy as it used to be, especially with COVID testing and the like. So I wish you all, those of you who came, a good road back, hopefully smooth sailing, and see you all soon. So thanks again.
Thank you.